Okay, everyone. Hello. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to episode 41 of This Week is Live. I'm your host, Raymond Flotat. So glad to see you well. Thanks for joining us. Sometimes the internet gods do not cooperate, and sometimes there's more news than you can possibly fit into one show. And that's where we find ourselves here today. This is our 41st episode, and this is going to be the most stories we've ever covered in a particular episode. I'm going to try to, compress to the best of my ability. I'm not going to try to spend an enormous amount of time on each one of them. Going to try to keep this all moving. Also, as a programming note, and that should balance things out decently well here, where I have no featured interview this week. And I'm sure that will return before long, but this week is just going to be the news and my editorial comment as usual that we do in the episode. So there's a whole lot of ground to cover here today, and good Lord, for a time when the movie and television industries are, kind of gridlocked to a standstill, this is a surprising amount of significant things going on. And also there's interesting stuff happening in the world of music and video games. So let's dive right in. Our first story has to do with, you probably guessed it, I know you're chomping at the bit to hear about this, extreme weather again. We've been bringing you a lot of stories over the last few weeks about how various events or festivals or concerts have started to be able to not happen because certain degrees of inclement weather are happening, whether it's extreme heat, if it's in the south, or if it's thunderstorms or lightning or hurricanes that are getting in the way of the ability for the standard live events we're used to not happen. So we had word and things started to trickle through, the edifices of social media that there was this festival in Virginia called the Blue Ridge Rock Festival. And this kind of deals mostly in what I would call modern hard rock and heavy metal. Okay. And, amidst the various bands slated to play, including Slipknot, were, other acts such as Evanescence, Five Finger Death Punch, Pantera, and, Megadeth, Baby Metal, amidst some bands that we're interested in here at Mixdown. And ultimately, this event was going to start on Thursday. People were camping or staying at hotels nearby and being shuttled in, and Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. So 4 days of numerous stage rock music. So big thing if you're really digging, like hard rock music. So Thursday begins, bands start playing, and they get as far as Coheed and Cambria, who get to play one song, and then almost out of nowhere, an extreme thunderstorm shows up. Now, people out in the open when lightning could hit is a very bad scene. You don't have to be like a physicist to know like how dangerous and of incredible proportions that is, that the potential that tens of thousands of people are in one space if a lightning bolt hits. So everyone is told to leave, everyone is told to evacuate, and apparently, according to the organizers, there was no word that there was a storm like this even possible, hence otherwise they wouldn't have had people in the event in the first place when this was about to go down. And, it's not terribly surprising. Sometimes weather just does that. What are you going to do? You can't make promises for the weather, and you can't really anticipate what's going to happen in terms of, a random thunderstorm. Sometimes it just rains. What are you going to do? Also, of course, and this happened in a story that we brought you a couple weeks ago about how, Ghost was supposed to play at an outdoor, amphitheater, and there was maybe delay enough that they could have still done the show, but then because it rained, almost all of their gear was ruined because, electronics plus water equals death. So, unfortunately, for the Blue Ridge Rock Festival, it was bad enough that they had to cancel the entire rest of the day of performers. So bands like Evanescence didn't get to play. And then the next day, Friday, was the one day of the festival that actually got to happen. Okay. Slipknot was the headliner that day, and the bands that were slated to go on that day did get to play. That day happened as scheduled. But then, again, kind of out of nowhere, another thunderstorm rolled in from unexpected places. And ultimately that caused the third day, Saturday, to have the plug pulled completely. They thought at one point maybe they'd be able to let people in. They were trying to see if they could wait the weather out. Ultimately, it was going to be too strong of a thunderstorm. And then day 4 got canceled too. So almost the entirety of this festival did not happen. Now, this is, of course, never mind the climate change reasons why something like this is going down. And this is starting to become a common occurrence in at least the North American festival scene. I can only imagine what's happening over in Europe. It gets very hot in the summertime in Europe, too, sometimes in September, just like it does here in Southern California. But, one has to wonder, because it's an immense expense to make a festival like this happen. As much money as a festival can make if it's a sellout and, tons and, 70,000 people are coming to it, it is not cheap to run something like this, to prepare for services, security, permits, safety, on-site, medicinal tents and the ability, to basically paramedics, excuse me, what I mean, to help people if there's medical emergencies, the lodging, everything, so much money, and never mind what the bands agree to be paid for showing up and doing their thing. And at some point, I have to just speculate. I'm not speaking specifically to the founders or the promoters of the Blue Ridge Rock Festival. I'm not speaking all about them, but just the American music festival scene in general. At some point, I would speculate that you're going to find that promoters are going to get really hesitant to do this. I mean, it is such an enormous expense and so much time and so much stress to make something like this happen. At some point, it's going to become not worth the risk. They're venturing so much money. And I mean, bands don't come cheap, especially with modern inflation. It's not cheap to hire bands like this to come play. A reunited Pantera is probably going to cost a fortune. Megadeth, even this far into their career, to play prominently at a festival, something like Five Finger Death Punch. I mean, that's a lot of money. That's going to be a lot of money. And at some point, festival promoters are going to be like, this isn't worth it. This is going to get to be too hard. Or at least I would expect you're going to see a massive contraction, a shrinking of what amount of festivals are out there. I mean, we're at complete market saturation at this point. Even my home state of Connecticut has a music festival. They're everywhere. They're in every state in America, basically. So moving on into somewhat happier news, the Mercury Prize. Now, we've talked to you a little bit about this in the past. Mercury Prize is, England's own kind of very special thing, celebrating British and Irish acts, originating in the continent, in their country. And ultimately, it's become very, very famous throughout the years for rewarding some of the best luminaries that were coming out of England and the United Kingdom. In the past, big albums such as Portishead's Dummy or Elbow's The Seldom Seen Kid were winners of the Mercury Prize. And unlike, say, the Grammys or even the Brit Awards, which is kind of the Britain's answer to the Grammys, there's not numerous awards. It's one award with a whole bunch of specific albums nominated for it. This year, it was The Car by Arctic Monkeys, Where I'm Meant to Be by Ezra Collective, Actual Life 3 by Fred Again, Beautiful and Beautiful Yard by J Hus, That Feels Good by Jesse Ware, I Love You Jennifer B by Jockstrap, False Lankum by Lankum, Hugo by Lowell Carner, Messy by Olivia Dean, My 21st Century Blues by Rai, hope I'm pronouncing that right, Nymph by Shy Girl, and Heavy Heavy by Young Fathers. And most of those bands will perform. It's a very fun special event, but ultimately only one act will win. And this particular year, it was the first time ever that a jazz act won the Mercury Prize, and that was Ezra Collective, Where I'm Meant to Be. Now, it's the first time that a jazz artist has won the Mercury Prize. So congratulations to Ezra Collective. I'm not super familiar with them myself, but of course, definitely warrants being checked out. It's a very prestigious and important award. Elsewhere in the world of games, a couple of interesting kind of technical and industry news in the arena of video games. Bethesda. Now, originally, Bethesda was kind of a distributor, a consortium of different game companies. People who are only a casual notion of video games might know of the game Doom or Wolfenstein. Well, Bethesda became the distributor of ID Software, the company that always made Quake and Doom, of course, but along with many, many other studios. So there's tons of very famous games that have been put out by Bethesda. And as a part of the console wars in the world of video games ramping up, what you now have is that the bigger companies, Sony and Microsoft, are starting to gobble up other companies. Microsoft, quite famously, in trying to support Xbox, had acquired Double Fine Studios, Tim Schafer's studio a few years ago, and then they had gobbled up the monstrosity that is Bethesda. Now, one of the things that was coming to be the big release coming out of Bethesda in the wake of this acquisition is a title they put out called Starfield. And in the last few months since Summer Game Fest and what would have been E3 time of year, Microsoft and Bethesda were talking this game up like it was the best thing Bethesda's ever done. Haven't had a chance to play it yet, and I'll tell you why. I've got a lot of things to do. I love video games, but I can't play every single one all the time. I try my best to play what's really cool, what's really exciting, but this is one that's probably going to be a while before I get to. But a little feather in Bethesda's cap is that Starfield, they are claiming, is their biggest launch ever, and 6 million people so far have played the game. Now, what's interesting about that number is that this is the company that puts out Doom 4, all of the expansions of Doom, and you would think maybe one of those would have been bigger than that, but apparently not. So Starfield, 6 million people, biggest game for Bethesda, and I'm sure a massive, 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 happy face for Microsoft in that. Now, just the other day, Apple Wonderlust happened, and Apple, like, the biggest in the entertainment industry, has realized that it's a fun and rewarding thing to do, to throw a big party in a very special glossy event celebrating yourself and your own products. And, hey, look, Apple being one of the biggest companies on earth, there's tons of like huge dorks that want to know every single thing that company is making and what they're putting out in the world. So we don't usually cover technology or gear. That's not really our jam here at Mixdown, but this particular year, what they announced is their new iPhone, the iPhone 15, the iPhone 15 Pro, and the iPhone 15 Pro Max. I'm sure that comes down to more to price points than it does anything you really need a telephone to do. In the old day, as Chris Rock used to say, it used to go bring for free. Not so much anymore. But ultimately, in the announcing of this phone, it's so powerful and so kind of souped up with features that one of the things that they put into it is what they call the first 3 nanometer chip. They're calling it the A17 Pro, and this is a graphics processor. So, phones aren't super big in the grand scheme of things. This is an old iPhone 6, for example, and that is very hard to cram hard drive technology, cell phone operations, all of the things that require to charge it up, battery, all that stuff. So they have apparently figured out a way to miniaturize an incredibly powerful graphics chip. And this graphics chip is powerful enough that first tier AAA video games, Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil Village, Death Stranding, and Assassin's Creed Mirage, are going to be playable right on the phone. You could use a controller, like a USB attachment. I don't know if they're going to do things where you can tap on the screen like some mobile phone games do. That might be a little weird with such big budget, elaborate graphics, AAA games. But they're super proud to announce that this phone is as powerful as most modern consoles nowadays. Now, how well that stack in the next generation of what's coming, probably not, because, video game consoles are usually designed from the ground up to be, the next generation of graphics processing. But for those interested, if you're a video game fan that does not want to buy a console, but you always buy an iPhone, they are saying that Resident Evil Village, Resident Evil 4, and Death Stranding will be available on the iPhone 15 Pro and iPhone 15 Pro Max later this year, and that Assassin's Creed Mirage will be coming in the first half of 2024. Elsewhere, we talked a little bit about the perils of the Electric Zoo Festival a couple weeks ago. And we talked about how the Electric Zoo Festival was kind of beset by problems. The first day didn't happen. There was controversy. They were claiming supply chain issues. There were reports that came out saying that there were actually permit issues. They were alleging this as much as we can say. We don't know for a fact, but there were reports alleging that it wasn't supply chain issues, that there were permit issues, and that there were things that were not completed and that were not done in time for them to be open the first day. So then the first day, nobody got to see anything. No bands got to perform. It was an electronic music festival, Electric Zoo, if you do not remember that from our previous broadcast. Second day, people got in late, but they got to get in and things happened. And then the third day, somehow, an open-air outdoor festival where tickets were sold in advance reached capacity. Now, that's a really interesting question, how that's possible, because by fire marshal codes, they certainly know how many people could fit there. I don't know if that's a gate crashing thing, like too many people snuck in and then that got them over capacity, what the actual ticket buyers will. Well, what's happening now as a result of this is that a couple of the attendees that were not able to get in that third day on Sunday have started a class action lawsuit against the organizers of Electric Zoo. Okay. And the two that started it, they go by the names Nicole Brockmole and Lauren Baer. And they filed this in the New York District Court. And they are inviting everyone to join them that was a part of this. And their lawsuit, their class action lawsuit alleges, they say, quote, a nightmare endured by thousands of electronic music fans. And they also say, quote, in addition to Friday's cancellation and perhaps more egregiously, things turned worse for Electric Zoo fans on Sunday when they were left to languish in heat wave for hours after being greeted by never-ending lines to enter the festival and eventually denied entry because the venue was oversold and overcrowded. Class action lawsuits take a long time to go through court. There's a very complicated legal process behind that. We're not going to give you a giant legal examination here, but it's not entirely surprising that someone would at least try to do this after, if someone paid several $100s to go to a festival, and the idea is that paying for the festival guarantees access, paying for a ticket at least, you could see that they might be miffed at that point, whether they have legal standing or not. That's an analysis we're not even going to get into here on this show. Elsewhere, in the realm of TV, and I mean, odds are you're well aware of this by now, but this happened not long after we went off the air last week. Danny Masterson, who has had a bevy of legal troubles over the last couple of years, coming down to rape allegations from previous girlfriends or women that knew him, ultimately has now finally been sentenced for his conviction that came on May 31st earlier this year. And the judge in the case has sentenced him to 30 years to life in prison. 30 years to life in prison. Danny Masterson, of course, earlier in his career was famously a part of That 70s Show, and then for a brief time, The Ranch with Ashton Kutcher, before these allegations surfaced, and he was fired by Netflix from that show, and that show, at least for a little while, went on without him. The judge in the case, Judge Olmedo in Los Angeles County Supreme Court, indicated, as this was all stated, that he will, after getting out of prison, if and when that time comes, parole or other things that may happen, that he will have to register as a sex offender if he's released. So there's that. It's part of a formal legal declaration, and said as a part of the sentencing, quote, "You are not the victim here. Your actions 20 years ago were criminal." Masterson's defense attorney, Sean Hawley, has indicated they plan to appeal, and they're vehemently denying that he was guilty of any of this, and that they say that this is all false and incorrect. And his attorney, Sean Hawley, indicated, "And though we have great respect for the jury in this case and for our system of justice overall, sometimes they get it wrong, and that's what happened here. Mr. Masterson did not commit the crimes for which he has been convicted, and we, the appellate lawyers, the best and the brightest in the country," interesting, and that's my commentary, interesting, "are confident that these convictions will be overturned." Of course, like many sentencing in serious cases, alleged victims had a chance to indicate their feelings on the sentencing and what happened. As an example, they are almost all named Jane Doe. Jane Doe number 2 stated, "No one is alone. Nowhere felt safe. I have severe PTSD, waves of panic attacks. You did this to me and all your victims intentionally." In the world of movies, now, of course, we've talked a lot about the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes that are ongoing and still being negotiated and not resolved as a point of press time here, and probably aren't going to be for a long time. So at some point, regular written scripted TV shows and movies are totally going to run out very soon, and there's not going to be as much video entertainment as people have been used to, especially these last 3 or 4 years. Well, we talked a little bit last week about how the video game actor portion of SAG-AFTRA is also considering going on strike. That's basically voice actors. That's the people who are doing their motion capture for video games or doing voice acting or narrating or voiceover for video games. So they may go on strike. Well, now an interesting development that's kind of been percolating under the surface for a while, and there's not much that can be said, like, attributably. There have been rumblings and rumors, and there have been allegations, anonymous reports coming from people that claim to be a part of the VFX teams that Marvel Studios worked on for making their shows and movies. And so the reports that have been coming out, which there's nobody that's going on the record, and I would assume, because if it's true, and I'm not saying it is, allegedly, they're claiming that they were alleged to have had to work enormous amounts of hours to finish the VFX for the movies and TV shows for Marvel. As Disney Plus ramped up, and as the pandemic was happening, numerous movies and shows had to be done kind of at the same time. And so it became almost impossible to keep up with the volume of things that needed to be animated. Visual effects is not easy, even with modern technology and the most expensive of modern technology. So there have been rumblings and rumors that people within the organization, once again, this is all allegedly, no one's really said anything purposely directly or stood up and said, yes, I work for Marvel and I'm unhappy. But there has been rumblings that there is a deep unhappiness about the amount of work that was expected of them. Well, as an interesting kind of development in this very strike-centric world we live in, now the visual effects team from Marvel Studios, along with its 7 subsidiaries, have unanimously voted to unionize with IATSE. For those of you that are unfamiliar, because of course we've been talking about a lot of acronyms lately, WGA, SAG-AFTRA, the AMPTP. Well, IATSE is the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, and you can think of them as kind of the union that originally came from, people who worked in theater, musical theater or regular theater, but then ultimately this has become kind of a bucket for anyone who's like a cinematographer or an actor or, a writer or director. It's everyone else. typically this is called the below the line people, right? And that's not necessarily fair because it takes an army of people to make a movie or a television show, set dressers and the people who record sound and the people who make sure there's catering or costumes. I mean, there's so many different things that qualify as a part of what IATSE is now the big bucket union for. So what we now have is that the visual effects teams from within Marvel and their subsidiaries have now voted that they want to be a part of IATSE and engage in collective bargaining as part of their contracts, their benefits. And IATSE president Matthew Loeb has indicated they will enter negotiations with Marvel and Disney with the full backing support of the 170,000 member strong IATSE alliance. This includes, just so you're clear, VFX production managers, coordinators, and data wranglers, but other employees, such as guards and supervisors, were left out of this vote to become a part of the union. Now, in the last little bit of news we have for you today, as I said, there is a whopping 8 stories today. An interesting kind of twist, and I guess not entirely surprising, is there have started to be a couple of programs on television that are starting to lurch forward, even though the strikes haven't been resolved. The WGA strike and the SAG-AFTRA strike haven't been resolved. And of course, most TV shows of any kind have some measure of writing to do with them. Even if they're just a talk show, usually there are writers that make that happen. I mean, like you see John Oliver accept an Emmy for Best Variety Talk Show. He comes up with like 15 people behind him because it's not just John Oliver bloviating endlessly on what he thinks. There's a lot of time and effort put into what he's going to say and the jokes he's going to tell. Now, what's happening is that there is a show, the Drew Barrymore Show I have not seen, just to be 100% honest with you, that was 3 seasons in, had kind of stopped a while back, right as these strikes were kind of to ramp up. And that show, the Drew Barrymore Show, obviously hosted by famed actress Drew Barrymore, who's been acting ever since she was a young child, it has begun filming its 4th season. And that started literally this week. Just a few days ago, that began. And what's now kind of happened is that this has become a flashpoint of controversy. Now, what's important to note, Drew Barrymore is returning and doing this show without support of a rights staff and is claiming in the doing of this that it is not in any violation of the terms of the strike. They're not using writers or writing or scabs to replace writers in the doing of this. I guess that means they're improvising everything. And ultimately, coming off of that, Drew Barrymore issued a very solemn kind of statement about the circumstances, situation. Who knows really what's behind it or why, or if there's, something in the network and contracts. But here's what Drew Barrymore had to say about this. I made a choice to walk away from the MTV Film and Television Awards because I was the host and it had a direct conflict with what the strike was dealing with, which was studio, streamers, films, and television. It was also in the first week of the strike, and so I did that. I thought what was the appropriate thing at the time to stand in solidarity with the writers, and to be clear, our talk show actually wrapped on April 20th, so we never had to shut down the show. However, I'm also making the choice to come back for the first time in this strike for our show that may have my name on it, but this is bigger than just me. I own this choice. We are in compliance with not discussing or promoting film and television that is struck of any kind. We launched live in a global pandemic. Our show was built for sensitive times and has only functioned through what the real world is going through in real time. I want to be there to provide what writers will do so well, which is a way to bring us together or help us make sense of the human experience. I hope for a resolve for everyone as soon as possible. We have navigated difficult times since we first came on air, and so I take a step forward to start season 4 once again with an astute humility. Now, there's already been the first day that this filming has begun, people outside picketing the show for proceeding. I guess there's like a notion of solidarity that, if there's a strike happening, content like this shouldn't be happening at all, where the finer points of legality come in and whether this is in violation of the terms of that, and that would hurt them, of course, after the strike ends. And if they were trying to use people from the union in terms of writing later, that could be the problem there. But the finer intricacies of that, I'm sure, are going to end up being a legal matter if ever one were to come to pass that expensive lawyers would have to weigh in, and I'm not even going to remotely try to guess whether this is okay or not. And ultimately, obviously, a lot of people are not happy that it's happening, whether it's totally fine and safe and legal or not. Similarly, this morning, and this is something that Mixdown hasn't reported on yet, that's probably happening literally as I'm speaking to you live on the internet right now, there has been a statement from Bill Maher, the host of Real Time with Bill Maher, who has long been a comedian and a political commentator and also kind of a referee, as it were, on his own show, having, vigorous political debate. Prides himself on being a person who has both conservative and liberal, speakers and think people alike on his show, and then open debate about whatever the issues of the day are in terms of politics. Now, his show has been off the air too, because of course, Real Time with Bill Maher has, an opening monologue, different vignettes, and a thing called New Rules at the end, which is, comedy. And so that's not just him, even though he is one of the writers. There's a group of writers who helped make that happen. And so this morning, Bill Maher issued the following statement via X. I hate even having to call it that, but what used to be known as Twitter. Real Time is coming back. Unfortunately, sans writers or writing. It has been 5 months, and it is time to bring people back to work. The writers have important issues that I sympathize with and hope they are addressed to their satisfaction, but they are not the only people with issues, problems, and concerns. Despite some assistance from me, much of the staff is struggling mightily. We all were hopeful this would come to an end after Labor Day, but that day has come and gone, and there still seems to be nothing happening. I love my writers. I am one of them, but I am not prepared to lose an entire year and see so many below-the-line people suffer so much. I will honor the spirit of the strike by not doing a monologue, desk piece, new rules, or editorial, the written pieces that I am so proud of on Real Time. And I will say it upfront to the audience. The show I will be doing without my writers will not be as good as our normal show, full stop. But the heart of the show is an off-the-cuff panel discussion that aims to cut through the bullshit and predictable partisanship, and that will continue. The show will not disappoint. People have already uproariously stated they're not happy with him for doing this. And once again, just like Drew Barrymore saying, not going to use anything that's against the rules, but then there are some who look at this, and I'm not weighing in on this issue myself personally. It's something I'm going to have to think about even for myself, that just doing this hurts the ability for the strikers to win in what they're looking for to extract from the producers, the television networks, the production companies. So those are our stories for the week. Amazing amount of stuff going on. Just absolutely nuts how many things are happening. And really quickly, just as a kind of a little story, to end us off here, I wanted to kind of amorphously cover a couple of things. And I wanted to talk a little bit about futility. Not something that's very comfortable to talk about, but futility is a thing that I think is worth examining and how anyone would deal with futility. Now, earlier this week on Monday, I went to and covered and attended Ghost playing probably the biggest show of their career thus far, headlining at the Kia Forum, the famed LA Forum, the Forum, as it's been called in years past. And massive show, massive indoor closed arena, and just a big deal for any band to get to the point where they can be big enough to headline that venue. It's hard to draw that many people in. And as I've kind of indicated in words and elsewhere in a lot of detail, it's a really big deal for a heavy metal band, which Ghost is arguably one, to get to that point. Very, very hard for a heavy metal band to get to that point because there's always an accessibility problem. So much of metal at some point turns people off. And of course, there have been times when metal has been, kind of the stylistic, cool, edgy thing du jour, but that isn't the case anymore, or at least hasn't been for a long time. So what we have in the United States, at least, is that since Megadeth in the early 90s, Metallica, Slayer, and Megadeth punched through to an arena level band, there hasn't been a new heavy metal band that got over that hump. A lot of bands have tried. A lot of bands, a lot of managers, and a lot of record labels wanted certain bands to. But of course, once again, comes down to an insular problem. That comes down to an accessibility problem. And, on some level, just taste and style of the times being in a different place. Well, Ghost has done it. Ghost is here. Here is the new champion of heavy metal and hard rock. And you're going to be hearing about them for decades, just like we have been about Metallica. So, a satanic band, unabashedly so, whether cartoonishly or totally seriously, is now the biggest thing in hard rock here in America. Now, if you're not familiar with them, they're fantastic. They write incredible music. Tobias Forge, the guy who plays the character Cardinal Copia or Papa Emeritus 4, many other monikers that are, fictional characters within the band that he's played, is an amazing songwriter. And he writes great music, especially within the confines of hard rock and heavy metal. And this was amazing. And, normally I would say any event, like A Perfect Circle has done this a bunch, where, a band confiscates people's phones. this happened at this event. Everyone who came in had to get like a pouch, and it had to be magnetically sealed in the pouch, and you couldn't turn on, hear, or use your phone during the show. And there are reports from people I knew at the show that saw people who somehow snuck a phone in getting kicked out of the venue for using their phone. Partly this is because the band filmed the entire performance. And ultimately, who knows what they're going to do with that? They might have a release with that or a concert film. Who knows? There's something will happen with that. But it was, I would normally say that's just kind of spitting in the wind, right? It's a waste of time to force people to not have phones. Everyone has a phone. Everyone has a phone. Everyone wants to use a phone. Yeah, it's annoying. Yeah, it's stupid, especially at a concert. But everybody does it. It's kind of hard to fight against the grain of how everyone is doing things and the way the wind is blowing. And like I mentioned, A Perfect Circle and Pussifer, Maynard James Keenan's bands, has done that to some level of success or frustration. This is one of the rare times I can think of where a band doing that, nobody on their phones. And it wasn't really like a crazy, I mean, there were pyro and there were explosions and confetti at various points, but it wasn't a visual spectacle the way that a lot of big shows are. Big video walls and, all kinds of graphics and, all kinds of flashing colors and, whatever. There was a set, there was a backdrop. They had a mock stained glass with ghost style artwork backdrop. And, there were points where there were other things that they showed behind them, but mostly it wasn't really a video wall. It was just them playing. The Nameless Ghouls, as they're called, all the musicians and even keyboardists and backing vocalists now. And then Tobias Forge playing Papa Emeritus 4, and people just rocking out, people going nuts. I mean, it was a wonderful, wonderful show. Reviewed it in a ton of detail late that night. We'll put in the description. We post this on YouTube later next week. We'll put the link to that in the description for you in case you haven't already read what I wrote about it. But this is an ascendant moment for a very deserving band. Now, one of the last moments in the show, because lately they've been ending all their shows kind of the same way, which is two of their very best songs, and that's Dance Macabre and Square Hammer. Now, if you know Ghost and you know their music, it's a super, super obvious choice. It's two of their very best songs. I have a few others that I like kind of equally on that level, but they're nowhere near as popular. But these songs are immense. They're wonderful. And I just wanted to focus a little bit on Dance Macabre because of the kind of underlying meaning of it and what it maps back to and, futility, like I mentioned. So Ghost has kind of turned an ancient concept that has been around for a long, long, long time, dating all the way back to the 1400s, and turned it into a fun song about, being together or, enrapturing someone or being enraptured with someone, and, kind of flipped it a little bit, but also in their typically sardonic way, in their very kind of dark black comedy kind of way, they have taken that as kind of like a place to be joyous. Doomsday for us all, but let's party until there's no time left, right? Like almost in a Devo-esque way. Devo always joked to say, we are the party to your apocalypse. And the album that this song came from, Prequel, was kind of about that. It presciently indicated at the coming of a plague, not long before the COVID-19 pandemic came, and how things would get really horrible, obviously evoking back to the actual Black Plague that killed such a huge portion of the population so many centuries ago. Well, the Danse Macabre, or Danse Macabre, as it's known, dates back all the way into the 1400s, and it comes from a couple different meanings. It doesn't have one exact origin, and in various ways it has connotations with religious text in terms of, the passing of Christ and kind of, as it's known, the dance of death, the Danse Macabre, and kind of that joyous exit from the mortal coil to an afterlife. And then it also became intertwined, which is, of course, some of the connection to Tobias Forge using it in the song Dance Macabre for Ghost, the Black Plague. And what the notion was that, on the one hand, that doom was inevitable if you caught the Black Plague. There was no surviving it, and some people would literally go into the streets and dance all that they could because it was going to be their last chance, because it could take them out in a matter of a couple days. And then it also took on an even more dark and kind of ominous meaning and message, which, there's a thing kind of lost to the modern world that, especially in a Western civilization type arena where we have this concept of freedom, and in a capitalistic system, a notion that we could ascend from being someone who was poor or living beneath our means to opulent wealth, rich and powerful, right? And in the times, centuries back, no one did that. You were born into royalty or you were born into poverty. There was no changing your class. You either had everything you needed and you never had to worry about anything and you just wasted time and money like it was all good, or you struggled your whole life. You worked way too hard, and there was no getting past that. As a historical kind of footnote, this is what, as America became as a concept, the United States of America, why you can see so many people came here from all these different countries in the world, because it was, whether it was true or not, the belief that there was a chance that you didn't have to live under the confines, that you were just born what you were. You could make your own way. That was the belief. Whether it's true or not, we're not going to debate on this show. But that was the belief that drove such a massive immigration to this country for such a long time. But in the centuries that preceded this, there was century after century where the belief was you worked really hard and then you died. There was nothing more to be done. You would struggle, you would toil, you would see nothing for it, and you would just be able to live for a little while. And thus, of course, this also became another definition of the dance of death. That there was an inevitable grip in your life that you could only do so much before you came down to it was over. You didn't get to punch through to a success. Now, of course, it's an interesting philosophical construct because then it, obviously a bit fatalistic in its olden times ways, but what do you do with this time when you're here? If it's so short and death is inevitable, if end times will come no matter what you do, what do you do with this time and how do you take advantage of this time? Or is it even really what it all looks like that? Can you really just make your own way in this world, in this universe? Are you limited by the confines of society or a system or a ruling of a government? What does it make you think about your own life and your own existence? That's really what's interesting about it, how it all stacks up and how it all connects. Now, once again, futility kind of being the overarching thread here. And in the case of Ghost and their song Dance Macabre, that futility is you should listen to the song if you haven't. It's an incredible, wonderful, kind of dancey, fun, big rock song. A love and, an enamoring with a specific person, how, want to be with you in the moonlight, want to be with you all night. Something bigger than the end, something more important. And something about that song, while it might be in a very dark subject, basically just screams joy, which is a big part of the reason the song is so freaking popular. Because it's entirely about finding that and it not mattering even if things are terrible. I think anybody out there listening to this that knows true love, that has someone that they can just depend on with their whole mind, body, and soul, knows what I'm talking about. How much that matters. The whole world can be shit. And knowing that person's there, it's okay. Not that love is curative, but having that as an anchor, a North Star, in the midst of your life means that much. And I'm reminded in thinking about this in terms of looking in the face of futility and trying to make something great and special out of it. A quick story about something going way back in my history and Mixdown's history. I'm going to go back to 2015, the South by Southwest Music Festival. Now, earlier in an episode of the show, we talked a lot about the mechanics of South by Southwest and how it worked. There were some years where absolutely incredible things happened, and there were years that really disappointing things happened, and a lot of money and time is ventured by a lot of bands, managers, and record labels. And there was one particular year where there were rumors going every possible direction that there was going to be Kanye West surprise appearances. Now, that had happened several years before that because Kanye was one of the biggest things in music at that point. But there were rumors that he was in town, he was going to do special pop-up performances. And there's one particular, event was Jimmy Kimmel was down there filming things and interviews for his show, his late night show. And he was going to be on Jimmy Kimmel. He flaked on Jimmy Kimmel. No one really knows why. Jimmy Kimmel called him out on it. Well, the biggest event that was happening in those years was the Fader Fort. The Fader Fort always had some of the biggest surprises. And for example, one year I went there to go see the reunited Afghan Wigs. And then halfway through the set, Usher came out. And then Usher and the Afghan Wigs played a bunch of songs together. It was amazing. It was wonderful. Well, there's one particular Saturday, the final day of South by Southwest, there was 2 unannounced secret surprise headliners listed for this Fader Fort event that had gone on, 3 days before. So the 4th day of the Fader Fort event. There was a bevy of somewhat interesting things happening, like famous names like Porter Robinson was playing. And, at the time, up-and-coming artist Tink, I'm surprised Tink hasn't become more popular than Tink has, but there was a thought to that. Well, ultimately, it was just this, let me not forget Alex G, who a lot of you out there do enjoy. And this was the weirdest kind of dichotomy of a circumstance I've seen. I mean, several thousand people. I don't want to give an exact head count, but I would guess 4,000 or 5,000 people at this outdoor venue, the Fader Fort, this pop-up kind of stage and concert event. And band after band seemingly not caring about the experience. Alex G spending the whole show just talking shit about it and talking shit about the other bands playing, didn't seem to care whatsoever. And then Porter Robinson coming up and literally coming up, I'm not joking, this is what Porter Robinson said, yeah, I'm going to do a DJ set, like 4 or 5 songs. It's like 20 minutes, I don't know. And then just started pushing buttons and queuing up tracks. I mean, almost the whole crowd, everyone that I was near, as I was there either going into the photo pit to do things or standing in the crowd to see what was happening, just kind of groaned. I mean, there's several thousand people there hoping for something cool and fun and exciting to happen and just kind of going audibly, ugh. Tink came out later with Timbaland joining her as a special guest. She was great. She was at least fun. And then Hudson Mohawk was an electronic artist kind of in the same vein as Porter Robinson came out and kind of was doing, little button pushing thing, sequencing up different stuff from triggered synths. And, the first of what I guess was to be 2 surprise secret guest headliners came. Of course, once again, most of the crowd there, no one had been told that Kanye was going to show up, but I think most of the crowd there was expecting Kanye to show up as a secret surprise headliner. We're really hoping that would happen. And the first of the surprise headliners was Travis Scott. And was one of the worst performances I've seen in my entire life. And the Travis Scott came out and, looked like he was high. I don't want to say he was. I'm not going to make any accusations here, but it just basically looked like he barely knew where he was and spent most of the show kind of just doing this. I'm not joking. This is what happened. I stood there in the photo pit 5 feet from him with like 20 other photographers and no one knew what to do. Everyone just looked confused. It was kind of like he was zoning out on the music Hudson Mohawk was doing. I think the idea was that they were going to do some things together. He kind of half rapped a couple songs, but then just kind of, it just went on and on. And at some point, Twista, previously known as Tongue Twista, who some of you might remember from Kanye West's first album, The College Dropout, and the song Slow Jams came out and sped rap something. People started to get excited for a second. And then he left too. After this, they kind of dragged Travis Scott out of the photo pit. I guess the show was declared over. And then an announcer came over the loudspeakers and said, thanks everyone for coming to the Fader Fort this year, and we'll see you next year. And like the whole crowd booed. It was the wildest thing I could have ever imagined. And it was just, wow. On some level, entitlement and some little level laziness. I imagine they probably weren't being paid well for that show, but the idea was like a leverage play for exposure. But it was just how many bands would saw their arm off to play in front of 5,000 people who are super jazzed, connected music fans. Just a waste. I walked 4 or 5 blocks up the road to a different event called the Thrasher Magazine Party. This was the Thrasher Magazine kind of, annual South by Southwest party, kind of mixed hip hop and punk and metal and stuff. And this particular night was headlined by the New York hardcore vets Sick of It All and the Dillinger Escape Plan. And it was the wonderful just breath of fresh air that I needed at that moment. Not necessarily because I'm a big hardcore fan or a big Sick of It All fan, but they cared. And everything about what everything Sick of It All said was life is difficult, but let's find a way to connect, and let's find a way to enjoy ourselves and feel good about ourselves. It was all about uniting the moment and uniting the event. And in the span of, 30, 40 minutes, whole place was having a ball. Everyone was jazzed, excited. It was, rage and fire and, not literal fire, but the fire of energy. It was just wonderful. And then after that, Dillinger Escape Plan came on. This was in 2015, mind you. They weren't a band for much longer after this. Famously broke up and have stayed broken up. Greg Puciato has gone on to numerous bands and also a pretty successful solo career that's rising right now under his own name. And this show was just magic. I mean, the extreme opposite of what had happened at the Fader Fort just a couple hours earlier. Like their whole mission in life was they were on life support and they were dying. And every single person in that place needed to feel saved. It was the wildest thing I think I've ever seen. I mean, all of the energy and fury and fire that could possibly be emanated. And it was like, you could tell they, like people talk about like Jimi Hendrix at Woodstock and how it was like one of the most amazing electric performances ever. This felt like what people described that set as. This was these musicians holding nothing back, putting all of their skill and their passion into this moment, into this connection. And for me, the highlight of this, coming back to our theme of futility, and of course, a lot of futility within everything else that was described here, was their song Farewell Mona Lisa. And if you have a stomach for heavy music and you don't know this song, stop what you're doing and listen to this song, because it's one of the most emotionally charged and riveting things in the last 15 years of music. I got to go through it word by word or note by note because it's a roller coaster. A lot of ebbs and tides, some furious breakneck speed, some super fast blast beat drumming, and then some quieter passages, some clean singing, and then like monster truck roar from Pucciato. And there's some pretty kind of key lines to this song that they, do they mean record labels? Do they mean the music industry? Do they mean all of society and culture? Speculate for yourself. But the words are, there's no feeling in this place. The echoes of the past speak louder than any voice I hear right now. Don't you ever try to be more than you were destined for or anything worth fighting for. This song gives me chills when I hear it because it's about futility. And it's about the feeling of trying to make something special in the wake of people not caring. In the wake of people not giving a shit, or things just being immensely difficult. People with their heads up their own ass, or people worried about other things other than trying to make things great. And that's what's kind of what I find inspiring about that particular song, is that it's a direct confrontation with that feeling of futility. Ghost is their impression of things is there is a love that seems to make the ending all worth it if there is an end to be had, and an end is inevitable. In Dillinger Escape Plan's hands, it's like a fireball being thrown at the hell you say. We can't make things amazing. Every bit of force and verve imaginable. And it's inspiring, whether they mean it to be inspiring or whether they mean it to be fatalistic. I'll let Dillinger Escape Plan speak for themselves in their own interviews and their own press and their own liner notes. But that's what I take from it. How incredible it is to see the force of will in the face of such lethargy, ineptitude, lack of compassion, lack of interest, lack of giving a shit. I mean, I've kind of made it a mantra, part of everything I've done at Mixdown since. It kind of the way I think Amanda Palmer kind of hinted at in some things she said on the internet. Instead of could not give a shit more. Care more. People say I couldn't care less. Probably we all need to care more. Probably just actually give a shit and how much it matters and it means in the face of all of this to care more. And that's, in my opinion, my response to futility. It can be as futile as futility can possibly be, but fuck it. Care more. That's it for episode 41 of This Week is Live. I want to thank everyone, as I always do, for joining us here, or if it's on YouTube, or if it's in the many numerous places we post these clips from the show, the things that come, whether it's in YouTube Shorts, or in Instagram Reels, or in Facebook or Twitter, or in any of the other myriad places that we post this content. We thank you very much for joining us. If you don't already, please subscribe to us on Twitch, follow us on YouTube. Make sure you're a subscriber, all the places that we do things. Of course, in YouTube, we are Mixdown Video, but almost every other social media platform, we are at MXDWN. Please follow us on all these places. We will be back next week live at 5:30 p.m. Pacific time, roughly. I know we're a little late today, and sometimes we're late, but sometimes it takes a lot to get all of this ready and prepared for the show. So we will be back next week, Thursday, live, and then, of course, then we rebroadcast these, and we package these, and we put them up on YouTube, usually Tuesday or Wednesday the following week, so this will all be up on YouTube next week. But then we'll be back with you live on Thursday on 5:30 p.m. Pacific. So please join us again for next week's live broadcast, and we're going to keep going. I think maybe we'll take a short break after we get to episode 50. I don't want to roughly call this a show with seasons and call this season 1 or season 2, but we're going to, I think we'll go to episode 50 and then we'll probably take a little break and then we'll start again and just keep going just like we have every week with headlines, stories, editorial comments, and probably a lot more interviews too. So thanks you again for joining us. Please join us again next week. So glad to see you well.